is finally published after the blog you wrote back in 2014.
Back in 2014, yeah.
How does it feel to have it finally out in the world?
I'm really happy, I think. I'm really happy. This kind of work has basically dominated my entire 20s. I'm 27 now, and I've been sort of writing on the internet, in print, basically since I was 19 in some sort of form. And this book was taking a lot of time, and it was definitely in my head for a really long time. And so I'm glad that I managed to get it out when I was writing it all those years ago. And I'm excited for the ideas to be received by the great British public.
And you were writing, these ideas were gestating, as you say, over the years. What were the emotions that finally prompted you to write that blog, which went viral, which was also called Why I'm Not Talking to White People About Race?
Well, let's just say that it wasn't for want of trying. It was after sustained efforts to try to engage white people on the topic of race for at least a couple of years at that point, and really not getting anywhere. Actually, it was like banging my head against a brick wall. That in that original blog post, I wrote that the words hit a wall of denial, and we didn't really get anywhere. I was absolutely emotionally exhausted. I wasn't just frustrated, I was in a state of emotional exhaustion and really had reached a point where I was like, I cannot do this anymore. And it was really a point of despair, but something changed, once I pressed publish. And I was no longer despairing because of it took on a life of its own.
So it went viral and had a massive reaction. Tell us about the reaction and some of the feedback that you received.
So I would say that the reaction split up into two camps. First, there was the camp of people who said, oh my God, Reni, you have literally articulated something that I've been trying to do for a really, really long time. Thank you. And then the other reaction was, wow, you fundamentally changed my perspective on this issue. But it's also heartbreaking that you might choose to make this decision, because it was almost a bit like a breakup letter, It was me saying, okay, I can no longer do this. Like, I need to withdraw for my own self-preservation. I couldn't deal with the angry denial from people. I was trying to have conversations about the nuances of a problem with people who didn't want to accept that there was a problem in the first place.
And you talk about those conversations, and it's so interesting that we're having a conversation now, because it's a book about conversations, full of conversations, and also about the silences as well. And you explore why those silences are there, and also why they're so toxic. Yeah,
sure. So I think that one thing that I've certainly experienced is being scared and worried to talk about race around people who don't consider themselves to have a race, almost certainly white people. In this country, if somebody has a race and we assume that they are not white, we almost think about white and whiteness as a neutral thing, and all other races are defined in opposition to it. But structural racism is a huge, huge problem in this country, and in the book what I do is sort of just draw together statistical data from lots of reputable sources, including, the Department for Education, the Census, the Department for Work and Pensions, London School of Economics, and I found that a black boy was 3 times more likely to be excluded from school than the rest of his school population. And I found that black children were being chronically undermarked at year 6 SATs level, the exams that you take to get into secondary school. And that was something that's actually rectified by anonymous marking. I found that black kids were far less likely to be accepted into the most prestigious higher education institutions in the country. I found that if you have an African and Asian sounding name, you are much, much less likely to be called into interview when you're job hunting than somebody with a white British sounding name, even with identical experience and qualifications. And I found that if black people were treated far more harshly in the criminal justice system than white people for the possession of drugs in particular, even though white people were more likely to use drugs. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about structural racism. We can't avoid going to school. We all need a job. At some point in our lives, we might come into contact with the criminal justice system or policing. And yet we have the evidence that shows that people are not being treated equally in these institutions. Yet when I was, a few years ago, I didn't have access to this data. Yet I was around people who were telling me you have to work twice as hard as your white counterparts to reap half the reward. There was an understanding there that something was wrong, that the institutions and the organisations that we might come into contact with every day were biased. And yet when I tried to talk to people about this, I was being told, you've got a chip on your shoulder. It's all in your head. You're victimising yourself, etc., etc. And that was the silencing tactic, I think, that attempted to try and stop people like me talking about gross racial disparities. And I think that happens to a lot of people. Now, I'm a journalist. I have the skills and the access to be able to look at this sort of data and pull it all together and create like a big picture timeline of how racial bias and racial discrimination distorts people's life chances. But not everybody has access to that. And I think that people who don't have access to that, who try to talk about an environment where they're like, I'm actually seeing that I'm working very hard and I'm not getting similar reward as my white counterparts, are being shut down and they're being silenced. And then they sort of begin to doubt themselves.
That's so tragic as well, the beginning to doubt themselves. It makes me think of the term gaslighting.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you're fed a narrative and fed it forcefully by powerful institutions and come to kind of internalise it and doubt your own sense of truth.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that I doubted my own sense of truth, but sometimes, I've done quite a few interviews for the book now, and people ask me, what most surprised you? Particularly when it comes to the section where I look at race inequality data and stretch it along the timeline of a hypothetical black boy's life. And I say, honestly, nothing surprised me. In fact, when I looked at the data, it confirmed what I already thought.
And you were just 3 years old when Stephen Lawrence was murdered at the age of 18, and you write about the fact that you remember the news reports, and you were such a young age, and then the time span of that case. So tell us about how that impacted you.
Well, it was more so that it was something that was constantly in the news throughout my childhood and right up into my early 20s. And, 2 of his killers were convicted when I was 22. So I absolutely remember the Lawrence family's struggle for justice. In terms of how it might have impacted me and my immediate family, well, at the time, it was just me and my mum together in southeast London, quite near Plumstead. So I do remember the community constricting in a way. There was a lot more fear. And I certainly remember that feeling of general fear. But yeah, I suppose watching those news reports repeatedly over the last few years, over those years, about the absolute horrible situation, not just of the murder, but the way that the police handled it, and the fact that it took such a long time for only 2 of the 5 of the gang of 5 who killed him to be convicted, really did make me start to lose faith in the system. It really did make me think that there are some situations where you can't actually trust the system to treat everyone fairly.
And one of the silences, which is so toxic as well, is around the history that we're taught from such an early age at school. I mean, it's astonishing that we're not taught more history of Black, Asian and ethnic minority people. And in the book, you very powerfully detail your research. And so tell us about that research into Black history and the things that you learned.
Well, it's Black and Asian history in particular, but I knew that the first chapter of the book is dedicated to that because I don't think that I can successfully make the political arguments that come later on in the book without setting out the stall for the context of Britain's relationship with race and racism, particularly as those Black and Asian people were often coming from former Commonwealth countries, until the middle of the last century were considered British citizens. Actually, I think that, Black and Asian people who are British have played an integral part in making this country what it is. But what I've done in that chapter is looked at how the British state treated them reciprocally, which was actually pretty badly. And I think that we have to be honest about that history. Now, I know that when I was at school, I was being taught about Martin Luther King,
Right. Yep.
Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman. I didn't know about Dr. Harold Moody and the League of Coloured Peoples, who he was based in London. In the early 20th century, it was like one of the earliest struggles for race equality in Britain. I didn't know about Paul Stephenson and the Bristol bus boycott that happened in the 60s, where Bristol's bus company and the trade union basically had an informal agreement where they agreed not to hire any black people, even though there was a sizable black community in Bristol at the time. Paul Stephenson led a bus boycott of the bus service until the company essentially acquiesced. I didn't know about any of that stuff, and I think that not many people do. I think that local authorities are quite good at championing their local heroes, but it's not something that is elevated on a national scale or even a global scale in the case of how we're treating Black American heroes. And so I needed to situate that context slap bang at the beginning of the book so people can understand those political arguments, because I think that sort of collective forgetting or almost whitewashing of British history absolutely leads to a situation that we have now where we completely deny institutional racism.
Right. And that collective forgetting, as you describe, is both in living memory narratives as well as going further back in history as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you use the phrase that, these histories are hard to discover unless you care, and that sense of a lack of care around these histories is something that you evoke really powerfully as well.
Well, I remember in school learning meticulously about the Tudors.
Right.
Oh, we spent a lot of time on the Tudors. I could tell you about them now. But I didn't know about 20th century history to do with race and civil rights struggles. And so it's quite easy for somebody in modern day to shrug their shoulders and be like, oh, that's not really an issue here though, is it?
Yeah.
When the evidence shows everything, the evidence clearly says the opposite of that.
Right.
And it's not written in our history books and it's not in our national curriculum.
And there was a really interesting case this week. It was reported in the news that a campaign by students at Oxford to finally get more Black, Asian and ethnic minority history taught on the history syllabus at university has been successful.
Yeah.
About time too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Times reported that. But what was really interesting is that the way that the Times reported it, it's going to be a compulsory module on the history degree, but the way that the Times reported it was Oxford bows to pressure. And actually how the Times has been reporting on students at Oxford pushing to, challenge the whiteness of their curriculum, asking for Oxford University to be honest about the wholeness of humanity, and also the university's complicity in celebrating certain colonialists who had horrible impact in places like South Africa. The way that the Times has reported that has been absolutely sneering.
In the Rhodes Must Fall campaign as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Times, that the headline that the Times went with, bows to, suggests undue, almost unjustified pressure. It's disappointing. That's really disappointing.
Really disappointing, and so insidious as well, that kind of language it's couched in by powerful organisations as well.
Yeah, because then of course the suggestion is, and it's not exactly a new suggestion, but that the people who are campaigning for this are just aggressive interlopers.
And you explore in the book, it's really amazingly subtle and beautifully nuanced as well. You explore how it feels to experience injustice and the fact that we are going to feel angry faced with injustice and faced with discovering this history, trying to meeting reactions like you've just described, and yet that anger is also painted in a negative light with the tropes such as the angry black woman and so on.
Yeah, I think in the opening essay I talk about, I have to be very careful with talking with white people about race, because if I get too angry or too passionate, if I get too passionate, what it is that I will be called angry, and then it's like, well, we can't listen to you because you're aggressive and you're threatening my safety. That happens a lot. It really puts you in a double bind situation. And I'm quite sure that now, in talking about this book in the public eye, I'm going to be called angry as well. even though I don't know if I could get any more deadpan.
Right, it's kind of difficult not to be angry about
exactly.
such injustice. I'm not going to like,
and
be
I'm
happy
not,
about it.
I'm not screaming and smashing up the room, but at the same time, I think that if you learn about these things, you know, I can forgive ignorance, but I think if you learn about these things and you are made aware and you're not angry, frankly, I'm concerned.
You're not a human being.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah. And then you kind of went to university, and there's this vivid description of you were studying a course on slavery, which, you know, not really taught about it at school, particularly the British. I mean, you say, there's a phrase you use in the book, the black British story is starved of oxygen at every level as well. And then you had this fractious friendship when one of your friends said, well, I'm not going to do this class anymore because it's not really relevant to me. And so...
Yeah, I mean, that was a friend who was white, and I sort of was very angry at the time. I didn't verbalise it because I didn't really have the language to, but I think what distressed me about that was the fact that they felt that this history wasn't relevant to them. Meanwhile, it was blowing my mind. But I think that it's everyone's story. I think if you are British, you need to know this. Right,
it's such an important point to realise that it's everyone's story. And one of the phrases that you use is, you discovered it in Stuart Hall's work, we're here because they were there.
Yeah.
Which is such a perfect way of summarising it, such a simple way of explaining a really complex history, but it's something that so many people are completely ignorant of, why we're here right now. Yeah.
I mean, I think that was Ambalavana Sivanandan, the director of the Institute of Race Relations, who sort of said that in a speech. Yeah. And it's absolutely pertinent to any continued conversation about race and racism in Britain.
And one of the many conversations you have in the book was actually an interview. You interviewed many people, including Nick Griffin. So what was that like?
Oh, I mean, well, I'm a journalist, so I often speak to people who I just need quotes from. I'm not their greatest fan, so I just treated it like that. Yeah. But I thought it was quite important to talk to him in this book, because I think that he's had a huge impact on how Britain is talking about race today. You know, so I think that this phrase, the white working class, that has really taken hold in like our mainstream political discourse currently. Well, I mean, if you look back to what he was saying on Question Time in like 2008, he was using those words, and he was saying that the white working class, well, I'm paraphrasing here, but he was putting forward an idea that the white working class are being besieged by immigrants who are hoarding scant resources, and actually that the state is pandering to them. And at the time, that was very quickly shut down with, oh no, like we don't stand for that. That was very quickly condemned. But actually that narrative is really back with a bang in much more respectable quarters. And what I wanted with that interview was for people to remember that. You know, I think that might receive some justified criticism around the idea of no platform, and people saying that his views are hateful and they should not be given a platform. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, they're already out there now. Not only that, but I think that it's about the context. The context is key. Right. And the space in which that interview sits in the book is at a very critical context, which, you know, once you get to that point in the book, you can very much see why what he's saying is so wrong.
And on the issue of class, one of the questions you're often asked is, well, what about class? And you brilliantly show how these things aren't separate issues.
No,
you show how
not.
Class is related, how inequality encompasses class, gender, race. And so, I mean, how would you respond to that question? What about class?
Well, I mean, one line I have in the book is, you know, when we think about a working class person in this country, you'd probably be better off thinking about a black woman pushing a pram than a white guy in a flat cap. And I use a case study from actually where I'm from, Haringey, in which a housing scheme was built, and you know, essentially it was aimed towards people who would want to buy a shared ownership property. So the council owns a little bit, and the homeowner owns a little bit. And analysis was done that showed that this was going to be out of the reach of low-income people. Now, if you do a little data analysis on who the low-income people are in that area, it's black people, particularly in that borough. They were much more likely to be living in social housing. people on the homelessness register, it was disproportionately women and disproportionately black people. So that means women of colour. So actually, it's not as simple as saying, you know, people who are sharing the brunt of economic inequality in this country are all white, because the evidence shows us that is not the case.
Right.
Now, that's not me saying that white people aren't also, you know, weathering the brunt of economic inequality in this country, but this new whitewashing of it is very suspicious to me. It appears to be a tactic of divide and rule, because the evidence shows that it's really not the case. And I know that, you know what, politicians aren't often really too concerned with evidence these days, but somebody has to be.
Yeah.
That's why I sort of did that analysis.
Right, and it comes back to evidence, and it comes back to those missing chunks of history. So you fill in here about how we're not taught the history of labour, and the fact that people of colour, black and brown people, were brought over to fill in, were desperately needed to fill in gaps, shortages in the labour market.
Yeah, post-war.
And yet we're also, at the same time, violently rejected.
Yeah,
and
post-war.
I think that's such an important point that you make. That,
yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think that the labour movement has sometimes not been very forthcoming about that reality.
Right. And the fact that some trade union people as well were rejecting Black
Oh
and
yeah,
Asian.
definitely.
Yeah. And so we've talked about class, and back to what you say was your first love, feminism. And so when did you first become a feminist activist? And that kind of changed as well, because you fell out of love a bit with that side of things. So talk us through that journey.
It was when I was at university, very cliche. You know, I read a book, it changed my...
That was second sex?
Yeah. And it just like changed my perspective. And then after that lesson, I went home and I Googled UK feminism, you know? And I found all sorts of groups and websites, and I just threw myself in head first. I really did. Like, I was absolutely burning with passion about the movement, and I found myself inevitably in almost all white spaces quite quickly, actually. And I realised quite early on that this is really important to me and important to the women around me, but talking about race was not a thing that you did here. So I just sort of kept it suppressed for a while. And then, you know, around that time, I also sort of started a blog, and I was writing about things and, you know, being involved in activism and blogging, and that was really exciting to me. And then I found myself in groups where I would try to talk about race or racism, and it would very quickly get shut down. I was told, you know, this isn't really the place for that, you know, really focusing on gender here, etc., and that was sort of disheartening. But I became more outspoken, and I also joined I wouldn't call it an activist group, more just sort of like a discussion group called Black Feminists, where I was then surrounded by women of colour who considered themselves to be feminists, and I felt much more comfortable in that space because I felt like I could be a lot more honest. And some of the stuff that we talked about in that space was these white-dominated feminist spaces that we're in are really difficult to be in, you know. For example, talking about something like beauty standards, there was never a race analysis in what beauty standards were, you know. So I remember being at a feminist conference once, and there was a session called The Colour of Beauty, and it was basically just a softly approach to sort of demonstrate that, you know, magazines were overwhelmingly white, like women's magazines were overwhelmingly white, and that was a big part of what beauty standards sort of were comprised of. And in that, I remember having a discussion with a white woman, and I said to her, well, look, they've all got light skin. That's something that they've all got in common. And then she was like, yeah, and they've all got long hair as well, haven't they? And I was like, okay, so I didn't say this to her at the time. Again, I didn't have the confidence. But what I wanted to say was, yeah, but you can grow your hair. It's not actually that difficult for you to reach that beauty standard if you so wish. But that's not an option for me. I mean, skin bleaching, but you're never actually going to look like a white person with it. So that was really, really difficult. And then as I became a bit more outspoken online, I found myself on the receiving end of ire from white women with quite big media platforms who call themselves feminists, who said that I was being divisive and aggressive and a bully. And that's when I just started to think, I don't know if I can keep doing this. And it ended up in a situation which I write about in the book, where on New Year's Eve of 2013, I was invited onto Radio 4 Women's Hour to talk about the year in feminism. And that broadcast ended up with, by the end of the day, a former Member of Parliament, Louise Mensch, was on Twitter calling me aggressive and a bully, trying to silence white people. What had happened was I was on the panel with Laura Bates of the Everyday Sexism Project and Caroline Criado Perez, who that year had campaigned very prolifically to have women on banknotes and successfully campaigned for that. And she was also on the receiving end of a campaign of harassment, rape threats, death threats, bomb threats, etc., and that was in the news all year. So the broadcast starts, Laura says her bit, interviewer turns to me, can you define intersectionality? And I said, well, it's about having a race analysis of feminism, recognising that women aren't all white, etc., etc. And then Caroline Criado Perez quickly took hold of that point and said, yes, and that's really important, but also, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, some women have been using that to bully me. So then what happened was that the interviewer turned to me and said, well, what'd you say for that, Reni? So I was put in this really awkward position where I had to account for her being bullied on the internet. And, of course, in the context of her being constantly in the news for harassment at the time, I wouldn't blame anybody for making the leap from that to, I was one of the harassers. Towards the end of the day, she apologised and said she hadn't wanted to implicate me in that, but that she could understand how it seemed like I had been implicated. But it was too late. I already had a former Member of Parliament saying that I was aggressive and silencing and blah, blah, blah. And a month after that whole mess is actually when I wrote the blog post.
So these were all the kind of incidents leading up to this blog.
It was absolutely awful. It was horrific.
And you explore intersectionality powerfully in the book and trace it back to its history as well, which is what you do so well throughout, going back to the history of things, whereas, we have this word intersectionality and people don't really understand what it means or why we need it, but you kind of explain when you first discovered it, for example. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that context is important, and that's why I always try to situate whatever's going on now in its context so that people can understand things a bit better. For me, I quickly understood it simply because I was, I came across a definition on Tumblr or something, not an academic journal, but it also made perfect sense to me because though I was a young woman who was like an ardent feminist, I was also somebody who was black, and that was absolutely changing my experiences of sexism. It was different for me, and it was difficult to try and get that across to white women. Who were very sometimes committed to saying we're all the same, we're all the same. And the more that I said, look, this white-dominated, whitewashed feminism is not fit for purpose for a broad-based movement, the more I became the problem.
And another really important word which you explore, give context to, is empathy. And you go back to when you were 4 years old, and you've been a voracious reader since an early age. And book's full of questions, and one of the heartbreaking question that you asked your mum, age 4 years old, was, when am I going to become white?
I asked her that question because I was reading, I was consuming the media around me, I was not untouched by the world around me, and I realised that the good people were white, and the bad people were not white. And I considered myself to be a good person, so that's why I asked the question. And I already had it in my head, I was going to be white, very pale, and I was going to have red hair and green eyes, and that was going to be me, and that transition would happen eventually. And I was quite devastated when I was like, no, Reni, that's not going to happen. And I suppose that was the first time in my life when I realised that humanity was coded as white. Yeah, it was. I suppose it was distressing.
And you describe reading, for example, some of the books that you read. We talked about beauty before, and all the gollywogs, for example, in Enid Blyton books, which you devoured as well, and there were all these kind of
the black people were evil, mischief makers, troublemakers. I think that fiction is one of the most, effective like accelerators of empathy in the world, like it's an amazing way to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and it certainly had that effect on me. It absolutely made me very, very familiar with a white perspective. It absolutely gave me a lot of internalized racism. Sometimes I think, whilst talking around this book, I've been told, well, you need to put yourself in a white person's shoes and consider this and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't think you understand. Like, culture's done that for me.
You've been doing it since you were born, the day you were born, in ways that people just don't understand.
Absolutely not, absolutely not. To the extent that I sometimes even second guess myself. And I suppose what I'm trying to do with this book is really unapologetically decenter whiteness. I really want people to know that this is not a capital W white perspective on race. It's something different. It's something that you're not going to have come across in your Sunday paper, or you're not going to have flicked through it, while you're flipping through your TV channels.
Yeah, and I mean the impact of what a lot of people don't realise is the impact of, to a young child, of reading these books, and when you're like, hang on a minute, like all the goodies are white and all the baddies are black. And those are kind of like some of the subtle psychological influences that people don't understand, but you really bring out powerfully as well.
Old school black scholars have called it like a double consciousness. You understand yourself as a black person, but then you also think about yourself outside of that, because you know how blackness is going to be perceived. To the extent where you will change your behaviour to avoid being seen as negatively, just because you know that if you're not white, there's already these negative connotations about what kind of person you might be.
And you discuss that in books and also in TV shows and films, for example. There's been a lot of debate about having a black Hermione, for example, but Harry Potter you devoured, didn't you, when you were growing
absolutely. This debate, late 2015, about whether or not Hermione could be black, because the play was being cast and they'd chosen a black actress. And I said that, well, the thing is with fiction, often by white authors, a character is not black unless stated. If the race isn't stated, then you can assume that they're white, because white is supposed to be neutral. White is supposed to be the default of humanity. And in terms of girls, I really spoke about that. I'm not a huge, massive fan of the show, but I think that created a huge debate about women of colour and feminism and race that absolutely, I think, has had a positive impact on feminism more broadly, at least in the Western world.
And we've discussed how conversations about race, I mean, they're often about representation, which you explore powerfully, but then there are these other issues as well, such as structural, institutional racism, and representation issue is something that we can see so much in the books, films, TV shows that we read as well, and also the impact it has on us psychologically. And going back to the first note that you started on, which was that sense of despair that you had, and kind of a battle throughout between hope and despair. I think watching some of these negative presentations, which aren't really representations of people of colour, can kind of foster that despair. So how did you gain a sense of hope? I know that writing for you is like a form of activism. But
I mean, honestly, I stopped watching films for like 5 years.
Wow.
I didn't really watch film. I'm getting back into film and TV now because it's getting better. But that's because that's because the people at the helm are changing.
Right.
So I think that you can't really talk about representation without structural racism, because structural racism affects the supply chain of who is represented. So if you have all of these inequalities in like education and employment and qualification and wage gaps, then it makes more odds are stacked against a black person to become the director or the casting director or commission that TV show, etc., or become that actress, that singer, that academic, that historian, blah blah blah. So it literally creates a problem in the supply chain, which leads to a lack of representation at those top positions that then we are looking at in culture. Not just people who are the actors and whatnot, who are the face of things, but also the people behind the scenes. And I think that the ways that representation has improved currently is because the people behind the scenes have changed.
Right, so the commissioners, right? So
Absolutely.
people commissioning TV, film, books, journalism as well, because you describe how you did an journalism internship after some persuading from your mum, which actually leads into another issue about, which I will come back to, about internships designed specifically for ethnic minority people. But on your experiences when you were doing that journalism internship, you said that it was blindingly white. The people of colour in the office were like doing the catering and
they were far more likely to be doing the cleaning and catering than setting the news agenda. Definitely. So they were literally cleaning up after and feeding white people. That's literally
right.
Yeah, that's not very good, is it? Is
no,
it? And then when you look at bylines, when you look at the bylines and you look at the news coverage, it's not surprising. Now again, I think that's changing slowly, because that was a while. That was like 8 years ago. That was changing slowly, but that was the thing that fundamentally changed my mind on the issue, because when my mum initially sent me that internship, was like, oh, consider applying for it. I was like, oh God, no, this is discrimination. If I'm going to do something like this, it's going to be alongside my white counterparts, blah, blah, blah. And then I got there and I was like, oh, okay, I see why this is needed.
Yeah. And I mean, the discussion about quotas is so heated, right? And it prompts a lot of resentment as well when people think that someone has been positively discriminated against. But it's that kind of understanding that's needed, well, actually, there's structural injustice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that, these backlashes towards positive discrimination are from people who don't recognise or don't want to admit, I don't know if it's willful ignorance or just ignorance in general, that the state of play currently is unjust. They really believe in meritocracy. They really believe that hard work will get you to where you want to be. And, look, that's a nice belief. We all want to believe that. But then I also think you've just got to look at the corridors of power and see the sameness of the people who are occupying that, to know that actually positive discrimination has already been in play, just informally. Otherwise, why do they all look the same?
Yeah.
Is that only where talent lives? Does talent only lie in the minds of white middle-aged guys?
Right.
Because I'm not willing to believe that.
No. And I want to talk about the style of the book for a bit, which, I mean, the book covers hugely serious issues, but it's actually in places really funny as well, and you bring humour to bear a lot in your style. And some people just don't think that humour can go with issues like this, but you've talked before about how actually looking at some of these issues, it's ridiculously comic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And did you find that humour was a way to kind of a way in of tackling the issues, or it just arose naturally?
It wasn't conscious, it just arose naturally. I mean, at the end of the day, this is me. This is the way it's written, is how I talk, how I think. I mean, I'm glad that you recognise some humour in it, because I think it's important to crack jokes and have some levity, but it's not something that I would sit down over my keyboard and be like, oh, okay, got to wrench a joke in here to lift the mood. No, not at all. But it's just sort of my internal monologue, I think, backed up with some facts and evidence. That's the point. That's the point of the book. I hope it reads as personable. I hope it reads as accessible. I just wanted for it to be a text that anybody could pick up and instantly understand whether or not they agreed with the general premise of it.
Thank you so much for...
Thanks for having me.
...your hour. And to everyone watching at home, I would urge you all to go out and buy a copy of this fantastic book, because it's hugely important, thought-provoking, and will change the way you think and talk about race.